My father gave my entire $175K college fund to my brother while I stood in the kitchen. I said one word, packed a bag, left. 5 years later, they walked into my office. What they saw made my mother's hands shake. My father said it without looking at me. Your brother has real potential. You should learn a trade. That was it. That was the entire speech. No preamble, no apology, no acknowledgement of what was sitting on the table between us. The bank printout showing a transfer of $175,000 from an account that had my name on it, funded by money my grandparents had been setting aside since the week I was born. He said it the way you tell someone the weather, declarative, certain, already past the point of discussion. My brother Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table with his ankle crossed on his knee, sipping from a ceramic mug I'd noticed him buy at a pop-up market last month for $28. He had the easy, unhurried posture of someone who has already gotten what he came for. My mother was at the sink, staring at the backsplash tile, doing the thing she does when she's decided that looking at nothing is better than being asked to respond. I said one word, okay. I went upstairs. I packed a backpack, 2 changes of clothes, my sketchbooks, my chargers, my grandmother's wooden sewing box, and the cash I had in my room, which was $340. I came back downstairs. Nobody had moved. I walked out the front door and I did not close it behind me, which is the only dramatic gesture I allowed myself, and I have always been privately satisfied by it. I was 19 years old. I had a high school diploma, $340, a sewing box, and the kind of anger that is so clean and so complete that it doesn't feel like anger at all. It feels like clarity, like a door that has finally been allowed to be what it always was, closed, and you just hadn't been in the right place to see it before. I never went back. I need to take you to the conversation I wasn't supposed to hear, because my father's 14 words were not the beginning. They were just the part that got said to my face. The actual beginning was 3 days earlier, a Thursday afternoon, when Marcus had come home for what my mother called a visit, and what I understood was a pitch. He and my father had sat at the kitchen table with coffee and documents and the particular, slightly conspiratorial energy of 2 people having a conversation they believe is private. I was at the sink doing dishes from lunch, which made me apparently invisible in the way that useful people doing useful things are invisible to the people who take that usefulness for granted. Marcus's pitch, as best as I could reconstruct it while pretending to focus on the dishes, had taken about 10 minutes. He was 2 semesters into an MBA program that he'd described to the family at Christmas as transformative. He had some terminology ready: seed capital, consulting vertical, digital first, but the actual substance of what he was proposing was simpler than the vocabulary. He wanted money. Specifically, he wanted the education fund. Dad, let's be real, he'd said, with the easy confidence of someone who knows the room. You've got 2 education funds. I need one. And Tori, what's she going to do with it? She draws pictures. He said she draws pictures the way you describe a 5-year-old's hobby. Not with contempt exactly, with something more dismissive than contempt, which is the absence of consideration. I had dishwater on my forearms and paint stains under my thumbnail from a project I'd been working on at 3 in the morning, because the only time I had to work on things I actually cared about was the time I was supposed to be sleeping. And Marcus described what I did as drawing pictures in the same tone he would have used to say plays with blocks. My father had nodded. He'd said, you might be onto something. I stood at the sink and I kept washing the dishes, because what else do you do? I kept washing the dishes and I thought about the education fund, which I had known existed in the abstract way of a thing that belongs to you that you haven't yet needed to use. And I thought about my grandmother Elsa, who had contributed to it from the time I was a week old. And I felt something happening in my chest that was not grief and was not rage, but was the specific cold settling of a person who has just understood something that cannot be understood differently once it arrives. 3 days later, the printout was on the table and my father said what he said, and I said what I said, and I left. What none of them knew, what I had not yet fully understood myself, was that my grandmother had left me something else. Elsa Hilton had spent 40 years hemming wedding dresses in the back half of her garage on a machine she'd saved for through 3 years of overtime at a textile factory, in a business she'd built by word of mouth and stubbornness, and the specific, inexhaustible willingness of a woman who has decided what she is going to do and does not require anyone's validation for it. She had charged fair prices and done exceptional work and banked every dollar she could separate from the household expenses. And she had, in the last year of her life, set up a trust, $12,000. 40 years of hemming wedding dresses, saved and organized and set aside with the help of a lawyer named Richard Keene, Esquire, whose contact information she had folded onto a piece of paper inside the sewing box. Along with the paper was a note in her handwriting, the particular slanted script of someone who learned to write in a different era and had never seen any reason to change. Your hands and your head, Tori. Nobody can repossess those. I called Richard Keene 3 months after I left, sitting on the bottom bunk of a 6-person room in a New Haven residential hostel, with $214 in my account, and a portfolio of work I'd been building in every spare hour since I'd arrived. I had been doing freelance illustration and design work through every platform I could access, charging less than I should have to build a portfolio fast, sleeping badly, eating badly, and feeling, despite all of this, more clear-headed than I had felt in the entire previous year at home. Richard Keene had been practicing estate and trust law in Connecticut for 31 years. He answered his own phone, which surprised me, and listened to my account of myself without interrupting. When I told him my grandmother was Elsa Hilton, he said, "Ah," in the specific way of someone encountering a familiar name in an unexpected context. He explained the trust. Then he said he had something else to share. He'd been preparing to contact me for several months, he said, but had been having difficulty reaching me. His letters to my home address had apparently not been received. He asked if I had been living at my parents' address during the period in question. I told him I had left in March. He said that would explain it. He opened a second folder. My father had sent an email to the bank on March 14th. 4 sentences, a request for full withdrawal and transfer of $175,000 from the UTMA account bearing my name to an account bearing my brother Marcus's name. The email included my account number and my father's signature block from his work email. UTMA stands for Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, Richard said, in the measured, patient way of someone who teaches complicated things to people who are encountering them for the first time. Under Connecticut statute, the custodian of a UTMA account, in this case your father, has a fiduciary duty to use and manage those assets exclusively for the benefit of the named minor. The account belongs to you. Your father's role is custodial only. Transferring the funds to another party isn't merely a family decision about money allocation. He paused. It's a breach of fiduciary duty. In some interpretations, it constitutes theft of assets from a minor. You have legal standing to pursue this. I sat on my bunk in New Haven with my phone in both hands and my heart doing something I couldn't classify, and I processed the sentence, "You have legal standing," in the specific way that a person processes a piece of information that changes the shape of their options. Then I said, "What would pursuing it look like?" Richard walked me through it. Civil action, discovery. The email was primary evidence. There was a window on the statute of limitations that we were still within. Recovery of the full amount plus interest was possible. The process would take time and cost legal fees I didn't currently have, though Richard said there were structures we could discuss. I thanked him. I told him I needed to think. I thought for 3 weeks. I thought while I took a freelance illustration project for a children's book publisher in Stamford that paid $2,400 and was the first check I had cashed that was actually significant. I thought while I moved out of the hostel into a room I rented from a woman named Deborah Marsh, a retired graphic designer who had known my grandmother slightly through a church connection and who charged me $550 a month for a room in her house with a west-facing window that I immediately set up as a working studio. I thought about my grandmother hemming dresses for 40 years and leaving me $12,000 and a lawyer's name on a piece of paper. I thought about what she'd written. "Your hands and your head, Tori. Nobody can repossess those." I called Richard back. "I don't want to spend 2 years in a legal process," I said. "I want to build something." He said he understood. He said the option remained open if I changed my mind. He said he'd keep the file. I took the $12,000, the trust document, and the knowledge that the March 14th email existed and was documented and would exist forever as evidence of exactly what my father had done. I didn't need to file anything yet. I needed it the way you need a foundation under a building. Present, load-bearing, not always visible, but there. I got to work. I built the portfolio first. $12,000 goes quickly when you are 20 and trying to build something from nothing, but it goes less quickly when you have learned to treat every dollar as a tool with a specific job. I bought a mid-range laptop, 2 software licenses for design tools I would have needed regardless, and a refurbished drawing tablet from a graduate student in New Haven who was upgrading. The rest went to rent, food, and the bare minimum of living expenses, stretched as far as stretching goes before it tears. Deborah Marsh was the woman who rented me the room for $550 a month. She was 64, retired, a graphic designer who had run her own studio in New Haven for 22 years before closing it to take care of her mother, and then finding, after her mother died, that she'd grown comfortable with the quiet. She had a west-facing room with good afternoon light that she was not using. She had known my grandmother slightly through a church connection and said so when I mentioned Elsa's name during our first phone call, with the specific warmth of someone who has good memories of a person and is glad to have a reason to think of them. She did not become my mentor. I want to be careful about that framing because it makes the story neater than it was. What she was, practically speaking, was a person who did not ask me to explain myself, who had dinner on the table at 7 when she remembered to make it and left me alone when she forgot, and who once, about 8 months in, walked into my improvised studio to tell me to come eat and stopped in the doorway looking at the work I had pinned on the wall and said, without particular drama, "That's very good." She said it the way you say something that is simply true and not a performance of encouragement. I have thought about that moment, those 3 words, more times than I can count. Sometimes the acknowledgement that costs a person nothing is the one that lands heaviest. I took every freelance project that had any relationship to visual design, brand identities, illustration, packaging, editorial work. I learned through the first 6 months to price my work correctly. In the beginning, I undercharged consistently, out of the combination of low confidence and urgency that characterizes early freelancing, and I corrected it as soon as I understood what I was doing. A brand consultant named Nadia Flores, who hired me for a packaging project and then told me frankly that I had charged her half what the work was worth, sat down with me over coffee one afternoon and walked me through how professional rate structures work in practice. She was not doing me a favor. She was correcting a market inefficiency that made the whole industry look cheaper than it was. I have recommended her to clients for 4 years since. By the end of year 2, the income was reliable. I formed the LLC, registered with the Connecticut Secretary of State, opened a business bank account. I took a small business accounting course online because I needed to understand the numbers, and I did not have the money to pay someone to understand them for me. I built spreadsheets that tracked every invoice, every expense, every dollar in and out, and I looked at them every Sunday morning the way my grandmother had looked at her ledger book at the kitchen table when I was little. Year 3, Sandra Park. Year 4, 7 people, a bigger office, the arts and culture niche starting to define itself through accumulated work and referrals. Year 5, David Owens, the Hartford Building, the Walnut Table, 40 people, the name on the wall, the name on the wall. Owens and Hilton Design Studio, in the clean letter forms of the word mark I designed in year 2. The one that took one day to execute because I'd been thinking about it for 2 years without consciously thinking about it, which is how the right answer arrives when you've been doing the work. I had spent hours on that word mark. I had put it away and come back to it and put it away again. The final version was quieter than anything I'd tried before, and more confident than any of them, which is the relationship between quiet and confidence that I have been trying to explain to junior designers ever since. Quick pause. If you want more stories like this in better quality, my Spotify's linked in the description. The folder had been in my desk for 3 years. I knew what was in it without opening it. On the days when the work was difficult or the business pressures were high or I had made a decision I wasn't sure about, I did not open it for motivation or comfort. I simply knew it was there, the way you know a load-bearing wall is there. Present, structural, not requiring constant attention to do its job. Then the intercom buzzed. Miss Hilton, 3 people in the lobby, no appointment. They say they're family. I was in the middle of reviewing a branding deck for a museum client in Boston. I set the deck face down. I looked at the sewing box on my desk, which holds nothing now except the note my grandmother left in it, and the document my father gave me, which I have kept because I believe in keeping accurate records of things that happened. I pressed the intercom button. Send them up. I watched through the glass walls of my office as they came off the elevator and into the studio. My father first, navy suit I recognized from at least 15 years ago. The fabric pulling across his shoulders in the way of a suit that no longer fits a man who no longer fits who he was when he bought it. My mother behind him, she had gotten smaller, or maybe I had gotten a better sense of actual scale in the years since I'd last been in a room with her, and she was clutching a Target handbag with both hands, her eyes already doing the thing they did when she was anticipating a difficult conversation. Marcus last, in wrinkled khakis and a button-down that might once have been ironed, hands in his pockets. They walked through 40 people who had no idea who they were, past the studio's logo on the slate gray wall, a clean geometric word mark I designed myself in the second year. The kind of thing you get right the first time when you've been thinking about it for 2 years without knowing you were thinking about it. Past the iMacs and the drafting tablets and the walls where we pinned current project work, past the conference room with the walnut table, past the junior designers who glanced up briefly from their screens and went back to work. My mother's hands tightened on the handbag. My father reached the conference room and sat down at the head of the table, out of pure habit. The automatic, unconscious movement of a man who has sat at the head of tables his whole life and does not register the act of doing it. Then he seemed to feel the room, the glass walls, the 40 people outside them, the name on the door, and something shifted in his posture, slightly and just barely visible. The shift of a man who has realized he is at the wrong end of the power differential. I sat across from him. I did not offer water. I did not sit at the head. You've done well, Tori, he said. He said it the way you say something when you are leading into something else and need to establish a baseline of generosity first. I always knew you were resourceful, not talented, not capable, not gifted or skilled or exceptional. Resourceful, the word you use for someone who survived the odds you stacked against them, the word that contains no acknowledgement of what they built, but only of the fact that they somehow didn't collapse. Resourceful is the compliment you give when you don't want to admit that you were wrong about someone's potential. It lets you admire the outcome without revisiting the assessment. I looked at him across the table and I felt completely steady, which is a feeling I have now associated with knowing exactly what I am doing and why. Thank you, I said. How can I help you today? He blinked. The question was not what he'd prepared for. He'd prepared for a reunion or a confrontation or some version of a conversation in which the emotional current ran in a direction he understood and could manage. We're family, he said. We want to reconnect. Marcus leaned forward. He had the same slightly too comfortable energy he'd had at the kitchen table with the $28 mug, the energy of a person who still believes that charm and proximity to success will function as substitutes for each other. I've got a few things in the works. Thought maybe you could. Are you a client? He stopped. What? If this is a consultation, I said, I'll have Janet schedule you. Our rate is $350 an hour. Initial engagement is typically 4 hours for a new business inquiry. The vein above my father's left temple pulsed. I noticed it because I noticed things. Enough with the corporate act, he said. The warmth had dropped out of his voice, replaced by the specific register he used when he decided that performing reasonableness was no longer efficient. We drove 2 hours. That's more effort than you made in 5 years, I said. He flushed. I did what was right for this family, and look at you. You got over it. You built something. Got over it. As though $175,000 redirected from my account to my brother's on a Tuesday in March was a bad mood that had passed with time. As though my grandmother's money, accumulated in 40 years of precise work in a garage, had simply been a temporary misunderstanding that I'd eventually moved past because I was resourceful. Got over it the way you get over a stubbed toe. I reached into the desk drawer. I placed the folder on the walnut table. Then I opened it. One piece of paper. My father's email. March 14th. 4 sentences. My account number. My brother's account number. My father's signature block from his work email. This is what you gave me, Dad. The room outside the glass walls continued. 40 people working. Phones ringing. Someone laughing at something across the room. My company functioning on a Thursday afternoon in October. My father's hand moved toward the paper. Stopped. He knew what it was before he touched it. His color had changed. I had a lawyer, I said. Explain the UTMA fiduciary duty to me about 3 months after I left. Richard Keene. He's been practicing trust and estate law in in Connecticut for 31 years. I looked at my father steadily. He also mentioned that the letters he'd sent to our home address about my grandmother's separate trust had apparently not reached me while I was still living there. My mother's head turned toward my father with the specific, sharp movement of someone who has just heard a piece of information they were not part of. "What letters?" she said. The silence that followed had weight and texture. My father said nothing. My mother looked at him and then looked away and then looked back at him, and whatever she was doing in that sequence I did not fully understand, but I understood that the look she gave him when she looked back was different from any look I had seen her give him before. Not anger exactly, something cooler than anger. The look of a woman who has just discovered that the ground she thought she was standing on had a different shape than she'd believed. Marcus stared at the table. He had stopped leaning forward. The $28 mug energy was gone. "Richard's file also includes the email," I said, "as primary documentation of the breach of fiduciary duty. The option to pursue civil recovery remained open when I last spoke to him. I chose not to, because I had better things to do with my time." I looked at Marcus. "I want to be clear about that part. I didn't let it go because it was fine. I let it go because building this was a better use of 5 years than watching lawyers talk." I looked at my father. "I won't be lending Marcus money. I won't be doing the family photos for the Petersons," which I assume is actually what the reconnecting includes, because those calls came through our contact form twice last year, and both times they said it was for Elsa Hilton's granddaughter, which is how I knew. I paused. "And I won't accept a version of this where you made a reasonable financial decision and I just turned out fine despite it." I stood up. "Janet will show you out." My father sat for one additional second. Then he buttoned his jacket, reaching for the wrong button first, which is what happens when your hands are moving without instruction. He pushed the chair back. He stood. He walked back through my studio the way he'd walked in, past the 40 people, past the logo on the wall, past the conference table where the email still sat face up on the walnut surface, past the iMacs and the drafting tablets and the junior designers who didn't look up this time because they had learned, in the way of people who work in professional spaces, that there are exits that don't require attention. He did not look back. Marcus followed him, not looking at anything. My mother stopped once near the door to my office and looked at the sewing box on my desk. She looked at it for 2 or 3 seconds. I do not know what she was thinking. She didn't say anything. Then she went through the door after them. I watched through the glass as Janet walked them to the elevator, watched the elevator doors close, stood there for a moment. Then I turned back to the Boston Museum deck, sat down, and went back to work.